Chapter 6: The Big Cycles of China and its Currency. In the chart below I plotted the same overall power gauge that I showed you in the first chart but applied only to China from 600 AD until now. It conveys how powerful China was relative to other empires in the world over that time frame. As you can see, for most of that time China was one of the world's most powerful empires, with the notable exception from around 1840 until around 1950 when it went into a steep decline. As shown, around 1950 it started to rise again, at first slowly and then very rapidly, to regain its position as one of the two most powerful empires in the world. As a result of their longer history and their more intensive studying of it, the Chinese are much more interested in evolving well over much longer time frames than Americans, who are much more interested in making quick hits, i.e., the Chinese are more strategic than Americans, who are more tactical. Chinese leaders don't just plan and try to implement their plans, they set out clear metrics to judge their performance by and they achieve most of their goals. I'm not saying that this process is perfect because it isn't, and I'm not saying that they don't have political and other challenges that lead to disagreements, including some brutal fights over what should be done, because they have them, in private. In summary, what I am saying is that they have much longer-term and historically based perspectives and planning horizons. They bring those down to shorter-term plans and ways of operating, and they have done an excellent job of achieving what they set out to do by following this approach. By the way, I have coincidentally discovered over many years that my studying history, looking for patterns, and dealing with tactical decisions has had a similar effect on how I see and do things. For example, I now see the last 500 years as recent history. The most relevant arcs seem about 100 plus years long, and the patterns I observe from taking this perspective are very helpful to my anticipating how events are likely to transpire and informing me about how I should be positioned over the coming weeks, months, and years. China's lessons and its ways of operating. Confucianism seeks to bring about harmony by having people know their roles in the hierarchy and know how to play them well. Legalism favors conquest and unification of all under heaven as soon as possible by an autocratic leader. Taoism teaches that the laws of nature and living in harmony with them are of paramount importance. All of these Chinese systems from the beginning of recorded history were hierarchical and non-egalitarian. The Chinese government is run from the top down, like a family, and optimizes for the collective, while the American approach is run from the bottom up, for example, democracy, and optimizes for the individual. Geographically, China is basically one giant plain surrounded by big natural borders, mountains and seas, with a giant population in that plain. For that reason most of China's world was within those borders and most wars were for control of it and were fought within those natural borders, mostly between the Chinese themselves, though sometimes between foreign invaders and the Chinese. As far as wars and the philosophies about them are concerned, the goals have traditionally been to ideally win wars not by fighting but by quietly developing one's power so that it is greater than the opponent's, so that one can then show it and have the opponent capitulate without fighting. Still, there have been numerous violent wars inside of China over the dynasties, though there haven't been many outside of China. Those that were outside China were for the purpose of establishing China's relative power, security, and trade, not for occupation. Traditionally, the Chinese have preferred to enter into relations with empires outside their borders in a manner that is similar to what one might expect from the previously mentioned philosophies, i.e., with the parties knowing their places and acting accordingly, and with their places determined by their relative powers. As far as Chinese money, credit, and the economy are concerned, the history is very long and complicated and went through the full range of money or credit or economic systems and cycles, so what happened in China is basically the same as what happened all around the world through the millennia, though exactly when and exactly how is a bit different. Currencies are used for 1. Domestic transactions, which the government has a monopoly in controlling and can get away with them being fiat and flim-flam, and 2. International transactions, in which case the currencies must be of real value or they won't be accepted. As a rule, the better money is that which is used for international transactions. The test of the real value of a domestic currency is whether or not it is actively used and traded internationally at the same exchange internationally as domestically. When there are capital controls that prevent the free exchange of one's domestic currency internationally, that currency is more susceptible to being devalued, which is also why one of the standards for being a reserve currency is that there are no capital controls on it. So, as a principle, when you see capital controls being put on a currency, especially when there is a big domestic debt problem, run out of that currency. Get out of fiat currencies during debt crises and wars, because they will be printed a lot to fund debt payments, which will lead them to be devalued and to high or hyperinflation. From 1800 until now. To bring you up to date to where we are now, I want to superficially look at the post-1800 period until the beginning of the People's Republic of China in 1949, then look at the Mao period until 1976 a bit more closely, then look at the period of Deng Xiaoping, from 1978 to 1997, and his successors up to Xi Jinping, in 2012, more carefully, and then look at the period of Xi Jinping up until now. Then we will look at US-China relations more closely. We will do all that in about 20 pages. To begin, I will draw your attention to the 8 measures of power that I showed you before for other countries and for China since 1800. It is shown in the chart below. Notably, unlike the cycles for the Dutch, the British, and the American empires that we looked at before, which went from their rises through or into their declines, the cycle that we are examining for China goes from its decline at first into rising most recently. While in a different order, as you will see, the same forces were behind China's decline and rise as were behind the other empires' declines and rises. The decline from 1800 until 1949. In brief, the post-1800 decline happened when a. The last Chinese royal dynasty, the Qing dynasty, became decadent and weak at the same time that b. The British and some other Western capitalist countries became strong, which led the British capitalist colonialists and a number of other foreign capitalist colonialists to increasingly take control of China economically, at the same time that c. The financial and monetary system broke down under the burdens of debts that couldn't be paid and the printing of money that caused the collapse in the value of money and debt, at the same time that d. There were massive domestic rebellions and civil wars. That severe big cycle decline, in which all the major strengths were in mutually reinforcing declines, continued from around 1840 until 1949. The end of World War II in 1945 led to the repatriation of most foreigners in China, except for Hong Kong and Taiwan, and a civil war to determine how the wealth and power would be divided, i.e., a war between the communists or the capitalists on the Chinese mainland. This over 100-year-long period of decline, which the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation, was a classic case of the archetypical big cycle decline occurring due to a number of the classic weaknesses existing, leading to mutually and self-reinforcing declines adding up to the big decline. It was followed by the classic case of a big cycle upswing in which the new leader wins control, consolidates power, and begins building the basic structures that are passed on to subsequent generations, who build on their predecessors' accomplishments. Mao saw capitalism as a system in which companies pursued profits through imperialism, i.e., through the controlling and exploiting of countries, the way the British and other capitalist powers did to China, in a way that enriched greedy rich people while exploiting workers. After all, this is what happened to China over the prior 100 years, and the world in the 1930 to 45 period was in one of the most extreme wars between the rich capitalists and the working-class communists. In the 1930 to 45 period, these forces were in the decline or conflict phases of their cycles, which led to revolutions and wars around the world that brought the two big ideological approaches, capitalism and communism, into conflict, which shaped the landscape of the 20th century. More specifically, the external war ended in 1945, which then led to the New World Order being created and foreign forces leaving most of mainland China. Then China had its internal war, which was between the communists and the capitalists, that ended in 1949 and led to a new domestic order, which was communism under Mao. Phase 1, 1949 to 1976, the Mao phase of building the foundation. In 1949, Mao was a philosopher revolutionary who was leading a class war of workers against the capitalists, had won the revolution, and was in the position of being the de facto emperor of China, titled president and chairman of the Central Military Commission, and Zhou Enlai became his prime minister, titled premier, in pursuit of the overarching mission of ruling the country on behalf of the proletariat. Economically, from Mao's founding of the PRC in 1949 until Mao's death in 1976, the Chinese economy grew at a rather good average annual rate of about 6%, with an average annual inflation rate of just around 1 to 2%, and the Chinese acquired around $4 billion in foreign exchange reserves, so it improved moderately but remained poor. This happened with a lot of volatility. As is classic in all cycles, internal political challenges to Mao's leadership and ideology arose. In 1971, China was threatened by the Soviet Union, which was militarily much more powerful and shared a 2,500-mile border with China, leading to increasing border threats. In 1975, after the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, which shares a 900-mile border with southern China, Russia built an alliance with Vietnam and moved in troops and arms. Mao had a geopolitical principle to identify the main enemy, neutralize the enemy's allies, and draw them away from the enemy. Mao identified the Soviet Union as China's main enemy and recognized that the Soviets were in a war with the United States that hadn't yet turned hot but could. That led him to make the strategic move of approaching the U.S. Henry Kissinger quoted Chinese officials as saying, "The last thing the U.S. imperialists are willing to see is a victory by Soviet revisionists in a Sino-Soviet war, as this would allow the Soviets to build up a big empire more powerful than the American empire in resources and manpower." In US-China relations, the reunification with Taiwan stands out as the most consistently contentious issues. 1976 was momentous because that was the year Zhou Enlai died. In January 1976, Mao Zedong died. In September 1976, and China faced its first generational change. Phase 2, 1978 to 2013, the Deng and Deng successors' phase of gaining strengths through economic reforms and opening up without creating threats to other countries. Deng Xiaoping became China's paramount leader in 1978 at age 74 with a wealth of experience under his belt. He was a reformer, so from 1978 until he died in 1997, Deng Xiaoping's most important policies were conveyed in a single phrase: reform and opening up. Reform meant market reforms, which meant using the market to help allocate resources and to help motivate people, and opening up meant interacting with the outside world to learn, improve, and trade. This led the Chinese Communist Party to start to bring capitalism into the mix and open up to the outside world. Deng knew that these two related directions to greater reform and greater opening up would make China stronger financially if it was not disrupted by the far more powerful foreign powers wanting to prevent the development of the weak China that he inherited. So the key was to pursue these directions in ways that benefited and didn't threaten those foreign powers, most importantly the United States. In 1979, Deng established full diplomatic relations with the U.S., which was consistent with his strategy to open up and reform China. At the time, China was extremely poor. Per capita income was less than $200 per year, so China needed the improvement and was no threat to developed countries, especially the U.S. These reforms later led to the first orderly and rule-based transition of power from Deng to others in the Next Generation Politburo Standing Committee, at first led by Jiang Zemin, then led by Hu Jintao, with these transitions occurring via the prescribed 10-year term limits. Each successive leadership team followed Deng's same basic path of making China richer and more powerful by making the economy more market-driven or capitalist, and by increasing China's trade with and learning from those in other countries, with those in other countries feeling more excited than threatened by their interactions and trade with China. Deng was a very smart, eager learner who was helped by knowledgeable outsiders to produce China's economic advances along its desired development arc. As is typically true in post-war periods of peace and prosperity, when the leading power isn't threatened and the emerging countries aren't yet threatening, the leading emerging countries, in this case most importantly China, can learn a lot from the leading powers, in this case most importantly the United States, as they work in a symbiotic way until the emerging powers become powerful enough to threaten the leading powers. In addition to benefiting from the learning, they benefit from trading with each other until that becomes disadvantageous, and they benefit from using the capital markets in a symbiotic way until that becomes disadvantageous. More specifically, the 1978 to 2008 period of fast growth in China came about because 1. the world was still in the peace and prosperity phase of the big cycle in which globalization and capitalism, i.e., the beliefs that goods and services should be produced wherever they can most cost-effectively be produced, there should be free flows of talented people without prejudices to their nationalities, nationalism is bad, and global equal opportunity and profit-seeking capitalism are good were the widely accepted paths to a better world at the same time that 2. In China in 1978, Deng Xiaoping swung the pendulum from communist and isolationist policies that worked terribly to market or state capitalist and open-door policies that worked terrifically. That led China to learn a lot, attract a lot of foreign capital, and become a giant exporter and big saver. Since 2008, the emergence of US-China conflicts and the end of globalization. As is classic, periods of prosperity financed by debt growth lead to a debt bubble and a large wealth gap. The bubble burst in 2008, like in 1929, so the world economy contracted and middle-class Americans and others in other countries were hurt, like in 1929-32, interest rates were pushed down to 0%, like in 1931, which wasn't enough easing, so central banks printed a lot of money and bought a lot of financial assets in 2008, like in 1934, which drove financial asset prices in most countries up starting in 2009, like in 1933-36, which benefited those people who had financial assets, the haves, more than the have-nots, so the wealth gaps grew, like in 1933-38. That is when the have-nots who were losing to globalization, especially those who were seeing their jobs being taken by the Chinese and by immigrants, started to rise up against the elites who were benefiting from globalization. As is typically the case, with economic bad times coinciding with large wealth gaps, populism and nationalism grew around the world, like in the 1930s. That is when the threats of the rising powers challenging the leading world powers started to become more apparent, and the era of peace, prosperity, and globalization started to wane, and the era of conflicts between the rich and the poor within countries and between the rising country, China, and the dominant world power, the US, began. During the 2009-12 period, debt growth in China was significantly faster than economic growth as a result of large fiscal and monetary policy stimulations that were deployed to help pull the Chinese and the world economies out of their weakness. Phase 3, 2012 until now, the Xi phase of becoming a world power. In 2012, Xi Jinping came to power and a new administration was chosen. As far as economics and markets are concerned, under the Xi administration, China aggressively pursued policies to reform and open up its markets and its economy, to gain control of and manage its debt growth, to more flexibly manage its currency, to support entrepreneurship and market-oriented decision-making, especially in industries that China wants to be a world leader in, to establish sensible regulations run by well-developed regulatory organizations, to build its capabilities in technologies and industries of the future, to broaden the economic benefits to extend to those people and those parts of the country that were lagging the most, and to control environmental pollution. It accomplished a lot that was consistent with these objectives. It is up to all government leaders in all countries to get the best balance between state, i.e., government influence and control of the economy, and capitalism, free market control of the economy and capital markets, through the proper management and coordination of monetary and fiscal policy. They each do it differently. How the Chinese are doing this can be confusing to people who don't discuss what they are doing with their policy makers and can't see the consistencies that exist amid these seeming inconsistencies. As far as foreign policy is concerned, during the Xi term, China has gotten stronger and more forceful while the United States has become more confrontational. More specifically, from 2012 until now, China's strengths grew. That became increasingly apparent and more openly shown. For example, the Made in China 2025 plan openly showed bold plans to dominate certain industries that the United States was dominating, at the same time that the American populist backlash emerged. This became most apparent after the election of Donald Trump. In 2016, Donald Trump's election as a populist president of the United States came as he tapped into the sentiment of those who suffered from globalization and were sympathetic to the view that China was unfairly taking their jobs and unfairly competing. That is when globalization began to be smothered and protectionism and nationalism began to be nurtured. At the time, China had become so obviously strong and followed a number of practices that American policy makers and most people found objectionable. Also, President Xi didn't hide China's economic strength and its ambitious goals to dominate a number of industries that the US was dominant in, to go global economically, and to more forcefully assert itself in the South and East China Seas and with countries in the ASEAN region. As a result, the perception of China as a threat or enemy emerged, globalization reversed, and the wars began, starting with the trade war and economic war, expanding to the technology war, the geopolitical war, and most recently the capital war. As far as China's internal politics are concerned, in 2018 Xi, A. consolidated power around him and his supporters, called the core leadership. B. amended the Chinese constitution to make clear that the Chinese Communist Party has control over everything. C. eliminated term limits for the president and vice president. D. created a supervisory commission to assure that government officials are operating consistent with the party's wishes, and E. enshrined Xi's perspective called Xi Jinping thought into the constitution. During periods of great crisis, more autocratic and less democratic leadership tends to be preferred. Conflicts between the US and China over trade, technology, geopolitics, and to some extent, capital intensified. Over the last 40 years, China's shift from isolation to opening up and from hardcore communism to market reforms and capitalism has had a greater impact on the economies of the Chinese, the US, and the world than anything else. What happened? A. in China and in the US. B. between them, and C. between them and the rest of the world have caused the biggest changes in the world. End of chapter 6.